Welcome to, are we on, Gloria?
Yes.
Welcome to the 5 o'clock meeting. Would you please stand and join us in the Pledge of Allegiance? Mr. Abadi, would you please lead the pledge?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Mr. Garber, are there any items taken in closed session to report?
No, Madam President.
Okay. Could I have approval of the agenda, items to be pulled from the agenda, or order of agenda items?
I'll approve the agenda if there's, make a motion to approve if there's no items to be pulled.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Please vote. Now is the time for public comments. Please come before the podium. State your name for the record, and please limit your remarks to no more than 5 minutes.
Hi, Lindsay Dale, Farm Bureau. I just wanted to extend a personal invitation to you all to our annual scholarship barbecue, which is this Friday at Desert Trails RV Park at 5 to 7. And again, all of the money raised goes directly to scholarships to local college students or seeking their education in the ag field. So again, that's on Friday evening. April 15th, tax day. So bring your refunds down and donate it to our scholarship. And I do also want to personally thank the IID for your participation in this year. Thank you.
Thank you. Please state your name for the record.
President Mendoza, thank you very much. Mike Abadi, El Centro. I was told at the last meeting that would be forwarded a copy of the operation agreement, the one-term interim agreement of the operation of the Drop 2 Reservoir. I have yet to receive that, so if that would be forwarded to me.
Mr. Kelly,
And anybody else that hasn't received it?
Would you follow up on that, please?
We do have it. We've provided it to the board, and we'll certainly make it available to Mr. Abadi.
Thank you.
I got one here, you can have my copy. Here, Mike.
Okay, anyone else like to come? If not, I'll turn it over to the board members. Comments from Director Sanchez?
A comment.
Director Desert? Almost forgot your name.
Yeah, I told you, Stella, you can call me Matt. In the agenda today is a listing of the expenditures for the last month or quarter. Are we going to have some time to ask questions about that, or should we ask questions about that now?
That was under the consent. Usually when we approve the consent part of the calendar, it's for no discussion.
Okay, thank you.
Would you like to pull, well, it's after the fact.
It's okay. I'll go over it with staff. Thank you.
Okay, good. Those are,
That's all. No comments.
I don't have any comments.
Yeah,
Director,
I'll be at Colorado River Board Meeting tomorrow in Ontario. That's it.
Director Hanks?
Yeah, no comment right now.
Okay, Mr. Kelly? Mr. Garber?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Moving on to consent, you can pull them now, if you like. I'm sorry, we did not vote on consent before. We voted on the approval of the agenda.
Yeah, if we could just take some time in the agenda to go over these expenditures. I had just a couple of questions, or one question about one expenditure.
Why don't you pull that number so then we can vote for the consent, and we'll come back to that.
Okay, which number are you on, Stella?
Well, under finance, do you want to pull number 5?
Yes, poll number 5, please.
Okay, we'll pull number 5. Is there any more to be pulled or not? Okay, please vote. Do I have a motion to approve consent?
Move to approval with 5 pulled.
Second?
Yeah.
Please vote. Okay. Moving on to information, executive, this is for the district's strategic plan. Mr. Kelly, who's going to take that?
Yes, President Mendoza, Michael Walla is here today to update the board on the strategic plan and specifically on two objectives that we're proposing for the board's consideration.
Good
Mr.
afternoon.
Good evening, Madam President and members of the board. As Mr. Kelly mentioned, my name is Michael Walla. I'm a BA for the Information Technology Department. This evening, I would like to give you an update regarding the IID Strategic Plan. Our last update was of November of last year. The purpose of this evening's presentation is to introduce the board to two new objectives, the Renewable Resource Plan and the Information Technology Objective. At this time, I would like to give the board an update regarding our target activities priority list. We have updated the board advisory committee with Director Desert, who has replaced Director Abadi since our previous update. As I briefly go through the slides, you will notice about 95% of Tier 1 is completed, 80% of Tier 2 is completed, and about 80% of Tier 3 is completed. Management hopes to have the remaining activities completed within a year or so. As was previously mentioned, this evening I would like to introduce two new objectives, one being the Renewable Resource Plan. IID has a goal to create an effective renewable resource plan for both short and long-term goals. Aligned with IID business strategies, local government economic development, and renewable generation developers. In cooperation with Andy Horn, IID has developed the following targeted goals. These goals were created because IID has been supportive of clean, renewable energy. IID is uniquely positioned to be a leader in renewable energy development. The successful development of these renewable resources depends largely upon IID's availability to expand transmission capacity with minimal costs to local ratepayers, while working in partnership with local governments and energy developers. If there are any questions regarding this activity or this new objective, Mr. Kolk is available to answer them.
Any
Dr. Kolk.
questions or comments from the board? Now, this is for information for this meeting, so we have a chance to take this home and review it and then come back and vote on it, right?
That is correct, Madam
Okay.
President.
All right.
Okay.
Hit your second one.
Okay. Our second one is the information technology objective. It has a goal to create an effective technology governance model, driving investment decisions that are optimized, aligned with business strategy, delivering value within acceptable risk boundaries. Dane Vaughn, our CIO, has created the following goal. These goals will allow IID to leverage existing technology and bridge to emerging technologies to advance operational excellence and optimize resource utilization. These goals are aligned to allow IID to effectively acquire, develop, deploy, maintain, and govern all district business information systems, control systems, and other technology assets. Once again, if you have any questions, Mr. Vaughn is available for those.
Questions or comments from the board? I guess
Nope.
none.
And as you mentioned, these two new objectives are brought as informational purposes. So next week, we will bring it back as an action item to vote to allow the two new objectives by assigning a board advisor if possible.
Okay.
And to also replace Mr. Abadi with Director Desert now.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
We'll move on to item number 8, page 79 on your agenda. Mr. Kelly, will you take this on? Disposition of surplus tangible personal property policy? Oh, it's Mr. Campbell. Who's the presenter?
As indicated in the packet, back in February, we had brought back a version to the board, and subsequent to that, and I think the board was ready to take action, but I had pulled the item for further clarification. The issue that had come up is there's 2 points of demarcation that the board and staff need to be concerned with. When is the appropriate time for the board to make a decision on what is surplus, and what is the appropriate mark for when the general manager should be involved with it. And as what has been incorporated into the language now is hopefully a representation of those 2 points of demarcation. And clearly those are options that the board can discuss and actually clarify in terms of however they want to see it. But again, a point of demarcation for board, we looked at and presented in the past that anything over $5,000 should go to the board for, according to the Water Code resolution, to declare those items surplus and properly disposed of. The challenge below that is, well, every time I throw away a pen, does the general manager need to be included
Very
with that?
impractical.
Very impractical. So we looked at the language as is highlighted in that the next page there that identifies if it's like office supplies, materials less than $25, that the managing supervisor in that area should have the discretion to instruct staff that it does not need required disposal documentation to have it eliminated. Again, the challenge is where are those 2 points of demarcation, and clearly that's up to the board as to where those 2 points should be identified. When does the board need to be approving disposition of materials, and when does the general manager no longer need to be included in that? So again, those are there clearly for the
Hear
board
you.
to have discussion.
I hear you loud and clear. Any questions or comments from the board?
I just have a question for Mr. Garber. Do you see anything in here that would violate the water code provisions?
I don't think so. We've talked about this before, and the code does require that the board be involved in the determination of surplus. If you're going to delegate to staff some minimal value, I think that that's fair and reasonable under the circumstances.
All right, thank you.
Okay, any other comments or questions?
And again, the other piece that
Bring it back on the 19th.
that we had in there is that anything for trade or would have to be would require CFO's approval on that.
Okay, all right, thank you. Mr. Abadi, do you want to speak on this issue?
Thank you, President Mendoza. Mike Abadi, Centro, California. On this demarcation of surplus, declared surplus above, was the same parameter set on the purchasing of this? And if it is surplus, where does the money go into which account so it can be tracked by the board?
I'll have Mr.
Mr.
Brogan come
Brogan,
up, but
would you
there are
answer the
two
question?
different accounts that the funds go back into. If it's for water, then it goes back to a clearing account for water. If it's energy, it goes to a clearing account for energy.
It was purchased under what parameters is determined surplus? Because water doesn't need anymore. If that is, it was purchased for a need. Now you're getting rid of it for not for need.
Right.
So which account does it go back into? Because it was budgeted at one time, but it's not budgeted now. So where does the money go if it's declared surplus?
Because
Which
Mr.
account would it
Brogan,
go in?
Would you please come forward? And that's a good question.
I believe it's going to be going into, if it's a water department asset, it'll go into water department revenue as a miscellaneous or surplus revenue item. And the same thing for the energy department. It will go back.
And what if it's a support department? Where does it go?
Well,
Half and half?
it'll be allocated between the two based on hopefully the way it was charged initially.
and again, that's been if you look back at the disposal of all vehicles, that's the same methodology that we've been using. If it was an energy department vehicle, then those revenues get charged or allocated back to the energy department. If it's a water department vehicle, then those funds would be allocated back as revenue to the water department. Shared services split based on the allocations.
Well, as a concerned ratepayer, I look back and I see as I was told that IID needed to collect this money for me for a certain piece of equipment, certain purpose, and now they're saying they don't need it, and now they want to put it back. The money's going to go back for some other need. At one time they need it, now they don't. So my question is, I said, if it's not needed now and it goes back just into the general, did you not need it or do you need more cash?
Well, again,
Why would it go into a general fund if it's identified before in a board approved budget? And how is that tracked? Is there a budget amendment that's required by the board to be able to do this? If you're not going to track every single $5,000 deal and don't need a general manager is what they're asking, how would you track something like that, knowing that they can break these things apart? Our equipment can range from 1,000 to 200,000. If you're not tracking, it could be multiple pieces of equipment that have an overall value of well over a couple $1 million. I'm willing to pay my rates to get the job done, But then it's come to a meeting like this and say, well, this is surplus. Now I'm thinking, well, why did you collect it from me in the first place? As a ratepayer, I want to know, why did you collect it from me in the first place?
Well, the majority of the items that we're talking about are those that would be no longer useful to the district, not intended to be equipment that was purchased, like a year ago and then identified as surplus.
I think, and which was I was Victor, or doesn't say Director Abadi. Mr. Abadi was kind of leading into what my question was going to ask is because obviously this is a policy, has really nothing to do with one particular item, but I think the board should, Kevin, draft some kind of policy where, or get a report back every 3 months of surplus money, because sometimes when the board spends money, we say, and we're unanimous in it, especially in closed session, and the general manager or somebody would say, we'll find the money. Well, I'd like to know if they're finding it in the surplus money or they're finding it and taking it away from some other projects. So it'd be good to track the surplus money and make sure we know where it's coming out of. And at the same time, maybe a quarterly report as far as all the items that were purchased in the past that we no longer need anymore because of updated equipment. If the money that we spent, what its usefulness was, how much do we get out of it, and how much are we saving, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, perhaps we can build some sort of a reporting component into this when we bring it back.
Sure.
Director Sampson, I'm glad you brought that up. And President Mendoza, it could have the appearance that, something, if you don't spend it, you're not going to get the following year because you're getting efficient, so you want to spend a certain amount. It could be, say, that you want to buy something one year that's just to hold the money and sell it and create your own piggy bank. And that's a deception that the public and the ratepayer can't afford in this economy. So if you need it, purchase it, but don't purchase it just because you want to create a piggy bank for the future.
Okay. Mr. Kelly, on page 80, I think there's a typo in the last paragraph. The board, did you get it, Gloria? On the first, the board authorizes, it says the board.
I think we heard about this yesterday, and somebody said that it was a reference to Shakespeare.
It was.
Oh, okay, cool.
But obviously
Whatever.
it wasn't. It's a typo.
Okay, thank you.
And we
Mr. Body?
hold Gloria Rivera personally responsible for it too.
She liked Shakespeare.
Mr. Abadi, thank you for your comments. Moving on then to, there's no other comments. Moving on to item number 9, page 82 on your agenda, Energy Department General Matters. Dr. Koch?
Yes, ma'am. A few short things. First, today, Governor Brown signed SBX 1.2 into law. This puts the district under a 33% renewable standard by 2020, along with intermediate goals between now and then. Second, I'd like to remind everybody again of Earth Day this Saturday out at IVC. Begins at 10. We're really looking forward to it. This Thursday evening at 5 o'clock, we're having a stakeholder meeting for the Renewable Energy Task Force between the district and the Board of Supervisors with the county. It'll be here at 5. It looks like we're going to have a tremendous turnout. I'm not sure yet whether that's good or bad, but we're going to have a very large turnout. And finally, over the weekend, we had a problem with the KNKS line. A breaker blew up. These breakers are approximately $500,000. Since then, we've been having trouble getting the breakers back in place. When the breaker first went out, we moved breakers around, then we had a outage, dropped the line again. It's been going on, and we're trying to figure out exactly what's going on up there with our breaker scheme and the problems. But to my knowledge, we haven't had an outage or an additional outage since Saturday night, but it's been a major problem for us to keep it going, and we have crews up there working on it.
So you don't know the cost of why the breaker malfunctioned?
No, we do not know yet. These breakers are very large, and they were arranged in such a way, it's called a breaker and a half scheme, so we can take certain circuits out but keep the bus going. When the breaker went, we just used a breaker from another position to keep the line going. At that point, we found we had some hydraulic problems. These are hydraulic breakers, which means they're relatively old. We had problems with those, getting them reset. Then when we were transferring the power, we lost two of the other breakers, which caused both K and KS to
Are
relay.
they both $500,000?
They won't be that much to fix. The one that blew up, yes, that one's going to be a problem. That one is $500,000. The two others that we couldn't reset, the crew was working on the hydraulics there, and I believe, I don't know for sure, but I believe that those have been fixed at this point. But we're trying to find out, why did we have essentially three bad breakers? These are mechanical breakers. They're not electrical breakers. How can you have three mechanical breakers simultaneously go? If it's electronic, you could look at it and say it's a lightning strike, something. But mechanical, that creates an issue for us.
Okay. Director Hanks?
Yeah, did it have any impact on exporting energy from the local generators?
Yes, sir. Cal Energy, which had complained to me earlier in the day, they have just come out of a outage, and we're ramping up to export to Edison, and Edison curtailed them beginning today for maintenance on Edison's lines. Cal Energy was annoyed that Edison and us had not warned them of the outage. I pointed out to them that, hey, this is an Edison outage. You have to coordinate with Edison. But as they're coming up, we drop them. Then we fix it. We start bringing it up again. The other two drop out. We drop them again. And the second outage affected ORMAT also. ORMAT should be up and running, or should have been up and running by Sunday. Cal Energy, if it's up and running, may have been curtailed today because of Edison.
Is there a dollar impact to us on that?
Not to us. We do things in a prudent manner, and an equipment outage, as long as we're maintaining the breakers in a prudent utility manner, we're doing the best we can to guarantee delivery. The best does not mean, although we would like to, the best does not mean we guarantee 100% delivery of anybody's energy.
Any further comments?
Yeah, I have a comment.
Director Desert?
The $500,000 breaker, do we have one of those in inventory, or what's the lag time to get one of those shipped into us?
I don't know the lag. We did not have one available. So that's why we moved from a breaker and a half scheme up there to a breaker scheme. In effect, we're reconfiguring the breakers at Midway. It reduces our flexibility in terms of ability to work on the substation until we bring another in. But we don't believe that we have one around that we could just drop into with no impact on our operations.
In this situation where you have three mechanical breakers go out at one time, it's concerning to you.
Yes, it's very concerning. Electrical, I understand it. It could be a lightning strike. It could be a short. We're having problems out by Turnip Hydro right now that we understand what it is. We just have to get out there and fix it. But it's an electrical issue. I do not know why we have mechanical problems. I mean, that you should not have three mechanical problems simultaneously.
So you're conducting an investigation to find out the cause?
Right now, I'd like to get everything fixed. Then I will hold them. Then we will get an investigation. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Any other comments, questions? No? Thank you, Dr. Cole. Moving on to item number 10, page 83 on your agenda, Water Department General Matters. Mrs. Shields?
I just have a few things to update you on. This Thursday at 1:30, the Water Conservation Advisory Board will be having its monthly meeting at the Water Control Center. On their agenda, Mike King will be presenting the system conservation plan that you all have seen previously and be able to respond to questions, and that's in anticipation of him bringing back the major work authorization at your April 19th board meeting. So if anyone's interested in that presentation, it's on Thursday. An update on the water use forecast. Reclamation is predicting us at about 15,000 acre feet under our order. I would again caution that that essentially means nothing at this point in the year. So it is what it is. The lake system is about 43% of capacity. The elevation is rising, combination of snowmelt runoff, and they're also equalizing the storage between Lake Powell and Lake Mead. So the reservoir is up about 30 feet from the shortage cutoff line, and they expect it to go up another 10 feet by September. So that's good news, at least from a water supply standpoint, to see Lake Mead fill up a bit. It's been significantly down and had the bathtub rings that everybody's seen in the newspaper reports.
Are those bathtub rings still noticeable, or are they covered up?
No, they're very noticeable still.
They're still, even with
Yes,
the...
there is some discussion that they will be reopening some of the recreational facilities that had been closed down. Some of the boat ramps you couldn't access and they couldn't extend them anymore, so it may bode well for summer recreation. 30 feet is pretty significant in some of those waterways. I had a staff report this morning, and there'll be additional information provided at the Water Conservation Advisory Board, but it appears that the wheat acreage is up pretty significantly this year, about 17,000 acres, which interestingly enough correlates to the same reduction in idle and fallowed ground. So perhaps some of that ground that's been sitting idle for some time is being put into the wheat crop. Our deliveries are also up to users from last year pretty significantly, about 150,000 acre feet more than last year. So obviously the ag markets have seen increased water demands. And finally, I gave you a handout, and it'll be advertised, I think, in the newspaper and distributed to Farm Bureau and Water Conservation Advisory Board. But IID is going to be hosting an irrigator training on May 5th. It'll be English and Spanish. I mentioned it last week. And it'll be to help teach measurement techniques to farm employees and help facilitate their ability to measure IID water the same way we water it. So we did this a couple of years ago, and it's backed by popular demand. And that's all I have.
Questions, comments? Director Desert?
Yeah, you talked about the levelization between the two reservoirs. Could you go over that a little bit more and explain what triggered that? I thought that was only triggered when the drought, when the water got to a certain level.
It's triggered by inequities in the Lake Powell and Lake Mead systems. So when Powell reaches a certain level above, from a volume standpoint, what Lake Mead is, they basically try to equalize the volumes. So in anticipation of a forecast of that, they've started releasing water. It's pretty certain that that's going to happen, and they also use those flows to help flush out some of the system, build habitat, recreate sandbars. But that it's a process that hasn't occurred in some time. But essentially, Lake Mead drops so low, and the demands in the upper basin aren't as high as in the lower basin. So rather than have the inequities, they try to manage that.
So they do that themselves. I think you educated me about if the water level got below another inch before all this rain and snow that we had,
right,
then there'd be a levelization between the upper and lower basin.
That's it.
That's what you were talking about. Thank you.
Any other comments? Thank you. Okay, we're going to go to, instead of going to item number 11, we're going to go to the supplemental agenda for the it's finance, and Mr. Broking, you're going to be the presenter. It's presentation on Water Energy Department's outstanding debt obligations as of February 28th, 2011.
Yes, as Director Mendoza just mentioned, I'll be discussing the Water Department's outstanding debt and liabilities, and I'll also be discussing the Energy Department's outstanding debt and liabilities. Start off with the Water Department. The total on-balance sheet debt is almost $125 million. We have broken that down into 6 categories: certificates of participation / revenue bonds, which is about 75 million of the total, and that's the mainly the 2002, 2004, and 2010 bond issues. The pension bond is roughly 31 million, and I believe that was those bonds were issued in 2001, and this is what the Water Department's share of that. And when I present the Energy Department's debt slide, you'll see that there's also a line item for the Energy Department for pension bonds. We have a small amount of money that we borrowed from the state Department of Water Resources, about $500,000. And then we've combined all our vehicle leases into a line item, which will be, the vehicle and the computer leases will be paid over the next few years, 3 or 4 years probably for most of it. The revenue bonds that we're talking about and the COPs, the payback period varies, but some of that goes out as far as 2034, I believe, especially for the 2004 taxable. And then the last category was the commercial paper. We had 15 million outstanding as of February, and that has been reduced, I think, almost in half since then. But at the end of February, that was the correct amount. So not only did we show the principal, but we showed the cumulative interest associated with that debt over the years. So a grand total that the district is obligated to pay off all the debt and the associated interest for the water department. It's about $219 million. And obviously that is a very large number, but keeping in mind the water department, like the energy department, it's a low growth business with high capital needs, high infrastructure needs, and it's very difficult to pay for large capital projects out of reserves, and even if you could, it begs the question of fairness: is why should current ratepayers pay for an asset that's going to benefit ratepayers for 30 or more years? So that's really some of the purposes behind the amount of debt that we have.
Before you go on, Mr. Brooking, on the 15 million, that's about 7.5 million, not 15 million, is what you said?
No, at that particular time it was 15. We have reduced that. I don't know whether it's to 6.5 or 8.5, but it's been cut roughly in half now.
Okay. All right.
And then the other item that I have up there, the other post-employment benefits, that's not a debt, but it is a liability. And when I talk about other post-employment benefits, that's pretty much the retiree medical benefits that the district has agreed to pay. We have an actuarial study performed every 2 years by a consultant. They've just recently completed their latest one.
I have a comment, Kevin. Maybe we could have a workshop on this. It was somewhat disturbing what Greg said, that why should today's ratepayers pay for tomorrow's when you've stated that we are low growth. So we're low growth. There's really not going to be any tomorrow ratepayers, so to speak. And then, of course, it begs to ask the question, do we sacrifice now so we have a better tomorrow? I like to have a workshop on that and the benefits of paying off all our debt to have a better tomorrow. Because as we all know, the people who really come back are our children. Not too many people, as a city grows, as Imperial Valley grows, you're going to get some more outsiders. But I think most people who come back right now are still dominated by people who've lived here and their children are coming back.
And jumping back to other post-employment benefits, that is almost $100 million based on the present value of benefits that the water department employees will receive over the next years. That number that information is in our footnotes to our financial statement, but it's not a debt as compared to the other 6 categories that we talked about before. It's not an indebtedness. It's really a benefit that the district will be paying out over the next years.
Do you feel that that's a manageable number for an agency the size of the IID, or is that a new number that's a surprise to you since the last actuary report?
No, it's not a surprise. We have been setting aside money every year for the current liability for both water and energy. We've set aside approximately $45 million. We've got money in the bank for that. I think when we compare ourselves to other agencies in the state, we're way ahead of the game because we have started setting aside money to pay for the expense or pay for the liability.
And the last actuarial report, what was that number for the water department?
It's going to be very close to that $99 million number.
Greg, of course, his question's always going to be asked. Is the $75 million, is that including water transfer bonds?
Well, there are no water transfer bonds outstanding.
Well, is that including, for example, would that be including so there's nothing from the QSA?
There's the 2002 bond issue, the 2004, which is the Western Farmlands, and the 2010, which refunded the 2000 bonds.
Any other questions?
I have a
Director
question.
Hanks?
So in the 75 million there, Western Farms is included in there, is that correct?
That's correct.
And that's roughly 30-something million? 36 or something like that?
It's 30, yes, it's 35, 36 million, I believe, is what's currently outstanding for that.
In the actuary that came in, I know 2006, 2007 years, there was some back years that we had to catch up on. Are we staying current?
Yeah, yes.
Actuary now?
Yes, we're budgeting based on the latest actuarial study that we have. And we're planning to come before the board once we get the CCA issue past us to bring an actuarial study presentation before the board. So I would expect that to be in the next month or so.
What potential bonds are we looking at in the near future?
On the water department, I think the nearest that we may have, and it depends on the final estimate on the Imperial Dam upgrade. Right now, my plan would be to fund our portion with commercial paper, and then once we make the repairs and get the project done, take the commercial paper out with long-term debt. But I haven't received a final estimate on that. The range I've gotten so far is anywhere from maybe 17 to 25 million will be the district share of that project. And then the other one, the other potential financing for water is obviously on hold until the litigation on the QSA is resolved. But that would be a financing plan for the water system conservation projects.
And that was roughly 300 million?
At the most, yes.
Energy?
Well,
I think it was 283 million or something like
yeah,
that.
it was 283, although that may be reduced to something less than 200, depending upon the final outcome of the projects.
Are you aware of any other off-balance sheet debts that we may?
For the water department?
Yes.
No, I'm not aware of any.
Okay. What about other potential liabilities? Do you have a figure in mind for possibility payback on some of these legal costs if we're not successful?
I don't have that number, and maybe Mr. Garber would have a better handle on that than I do.
We reserve for legal exposures, but I'm not sure which legal cost you're talking about. And I don't know if you want to talk about that here or
Yeah.
maybe in closed session.
I just.
But we do, on an annual basis, meet with the finance department and set certain reserves for contemplated potential legal exposures. Now, exactly how they book and account for those reserves, I don't know. You'd have to ask Craig.
Specifically regarding the QSA litigation, we have been reimbursed for several $1 million of expenses for that litigation.
And the only other one I could think of, what would be water's share of a facility build-out?
Just jump in.
I've been given preliminary numbers of roughly, 30 million for a yard, and I can't remember whether it was 50 million or 70 million for an admin building. But if you split it 50-50, on 100 million, I'm thinking the debt service is going to be around $3.5 to $4 million a year, and energy would pay the same amount on a 50-50 split.
Any other questions, Director Desert?
Yeah, I have one question on the water side. We talked about the build out of the water system and the debt being up towards potentially a $300 million. Does that number include the monies that we're going to receive from any transfers? Or are we on the line for the $300 million to bond the whole thing, or do we get assistance on the QSA transfers?
Well, we have $50 million already that's in our control that we can use for the water system conservation projects. So any borrowings that we would need would be reduced by that amount of money that we have, and then subject to the clawback provision.
And we talked about the debt service a little while ago on another issue, just a minute ago. What would the projected debt service be for the water department for the build out of the water infrastructure?
I have that, but I don't know that off the top of my head. And that's another presentation that we were planning on making too, is our water and energy department forecast, long-term forecast that we'd bring back before the board that would show our assumptions, growth assumptions, along with expected rate increases that we would need and debt that we'd have to issue.
And then the service of that same bonding issue, the debt service on that from the water department side, that money, our water rates are set now to advance and handle that, or are we going to be addressing a separate issue for that debt service?
Right now, and I should give the disclaimer up front. It's, these are our projections, and they're going out many years, and for the water department, in fact, they're going out to 2047. So we expect our forecast to change and maybe even change considerably. But right now, what we have for a water department rate increases is I think it's 2021, we have $1 an acre foot for each class of customer for either 5 or 6 years, and we have no other water rate increases. We expect the water transfer, if it goes according to our forecast, to be able to subsidize the water department and replace most of the existing infrastructure and pay the debt service on the water system conservation project.
So 2021 would be the next time we'd be looking at.
That's what we have right now in our forecast. Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
And would that be enough money to repair or maintain our existing water infrastructure?
Well, the forecast includes $1.4 billion that we replace. If that's all it takes, then we would have enough. If it's more than that, then we may not have enough.
I have 2 questions. One, on the commercial paper, that $15 million, that's a variable, right? It could go up and down or down?
Yes.
Yeah.
Right now.
So that number will change?
Well, the amount.
Not the $15 million, but the interest portion.
Yes. Generally, we roll it over every 7 to 30 days, and we're paying, I think, around 0.3
I think that's important to let the public know because
It's
you
a
have a
very,
set
very
number
low
there.
amount, yeah.
And then my next question is I want to talk about something positive, if there is anything positive on it, is the $300 million for the water transfer bond. How will by San Diego paying that portion of our bond through the transfer, wouldn't that give us a positive effect on our credit rating, such a large loan, and being able to make those payments on time? You think that'll get us up to a AAA?
I don't think we'll ever get up to a AAA.
But I guess I'd like to know that on such a large loan like that, and then able to make those payments through the transfer from the IID, because that eventually when we want to fix such as the canal systems of the maintenance, that we can go out and get a low interest rate on a loan because we have such good credit.
Right, and the good credit comes with the good coverages, and my immediate goal is try to get both rating agencies. We're using Moody's and S&P. Neither one of us have us rated at AA, but that's my goal, the intermediate step. But it just takes time. They move very slowly. They do not upgrade anything very fast. And what we need to do to show over the next few years is consistently strong debt service coverages. And then we have a case, providing we can maintain quite a bit of cash with liquidity, that they will upgrade us. And then when we do need to borrow, then we would borrow at a lower interest rate because our credit rating is higher.
Director Desert.
On the 300 million, back to the 300 million, and we're going to receive 50 from San Diego and upwards of 70 or 80 currently that we have in the bank are supposed to. So that leaves about a bonding requirement there of some 200 million. Does that sound about right, that we would have to go out and bond for
I think in our forecast we have something over 200 million in total. I think it's around 230 or 240.
And what date in your forecast are you programmed for us to have to go out and bond that 200
well,
plus?
right now we have a placeholder at 2013, but it's all driven by the litigation in my mind.
But say it kicked in 2013, we'd then be servicing a $200 million debt, and our water revenues are adequate to service another $200 million debt?
Well, we wouldn't borrow it all at one time, but the forecast, yes, is great enough because of the increased water transfers and increased amount for the water transfers. Yes, it would be able to service up to around $240 or $250 million at the interest rate that we're forecasting, which I think is about 6%.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
Director Hanks?
When I met with you, you had another set of papers with the yearly payments,
Yes.
interest.
Yes.
Will you be bringing that back to us?
I can certainly do that, yes.
I think it'd be helpful, and I'd also like to go back and revisit where we were talking about breaking down what % of our rates goes to pay for interest and how much for principal.
Yes, I have that in the ECA presentation. And
okay. Thank you.
Any other questions? Not. Go on to energy, please.
As you see, energy has one extra category. It has on-balance sheet debt, it has off-balance sheet debt, and then the OPEB liability. Certificates of participation revenue bonds. That's comprised of three issues. I think it's the 2003 issue, the 2008 issue, which is the largest, and our most recent one of 2011 of $78 million. The $32 million is the Energy Department's share of the pension bond, minimal vehicle and computer leases when you compare it to the total on-balance sheet debt for the department, about $421 million. Same situation. I view it as the water department. It's a low growth, very capital intensive business. Requires a lot of money to fund the capital program. That's the reason for the debt. And in addition to the on-balance sheet debt, there's off-balance sheet debt that is We're a member of a joint action agency or joint powers authority, SCAPA, Southern California Public Power Authority, and we're a participant in the San Juan and Palo Verde projects. Those projects, or the debt associated with those projects, do not show up as a debt on our books. They show up as a purchase power. They're capacity payments that we make, but we're required to make them. Therefore, the debt service for the money is borrowed. There's a footnote in the audited financials that explains both of those projects and the amount of money that is owed over the next few years. As you can see, there's very limited debt left on the Palo Verde project for us, but about $70 million for San Juan. So when you look at total debt on and off balance sheet, it's almost $500 million. You add the interest associated with that, and over the next years, the Energy Department will be paying close to, or a little over $900 million principal and interest. And then just the last thing, the other post-employment benefit for energy, its share of the $280 million is $180 million or $181 million.
Questions, comments?
The 382, that's not, is that including the projected?
No, none of these have projected. These are debts that indebtedness that the district has incurred and is making principal and interest payments on. But if it's that's a good time for me to talk about what we're proposing to do. I think you all know that in February we closed on about $78 million for a portion of the El Centro Unit 3 project. That's roughly a $250 million project. We're going to need to borrow another $150 or $175 million to pay for that project. We're starting what I call phase 2 as we speak. We hope to have everything put together and bring back documents for the board's approval in May or June. And then after we do that, we may do phase 3. The concern here is that with rising interest rates, the longer we wait, the more we'll have to pay, and we'd like to, get enough money in the bank to be able to complete that project and have it.
Mr. Brooking, the Build America bonds, they're gone.
Yes, there is some talk to resurrect them. I'm not sure how far it'll get, but it will not be as a lucrative a deal for us because they're going to, if they do reinstate them, I think it's going to be at a lower subsidy. I've seen anywhere as low as 28% as opposed to 35%.
And we missed because of litigation.
Because of litigation, yes.
From Mike Morgan and Mr. Foster, we blew that chance.
Yeah, that unfortunately the chance to get 4% interest rates has passed us by, and now we're looking in the 5.5% to 6% range.
What a shame.
Is that 78? Is that included in the 382?
That's in the 382, yes, sir.
Yeah.
But, Mr. Brogan, on that Build America bonds on the 4%, there was going to be, what was it, a 30% forgiveness on the interest is what that was?
Well, it was a 35% credit from the federal government. They were going to reimburse us for 35% of the interest that we paid to the investors.
That was on the 4% interest on a Build America?
Well, actually, the total interest rate was probably somewhere around 7%, but when you factor in the credit of 35%, it makes it right around 4%.
Okay, because I was asked that question Monday at Farm Bureau, and I couldn't quite explain it to them. So the interest would have been closer to 7, but with a 30%, the 35% would have brought it down to a 4%
Our
interest
impact,
rate.
yes. The Build America bonds are taxable bonds, so they were higher interest rate than what we normally issue through tax exempt.
Well, with the rates you're having to borrow at now, it's going to cost you another $80 to $120 million to finance that project over the life of the project. Correct?
Yeah, that's our estimate. I mean, when we finish our financing, we can give you a narrower range of the impact. But right now, yes, that's what we're thinking.
All right, thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
Yeah, I've got a couple. Was there any errors in the way that bond was written? That Build America bond?
You mean I guess I don't quite understand the
Well,
question.
I'm still not, I still don't understand why we didn't move forward with it.
Oh, well, when the litigation was brought forward, and, you know, it was a disclosable item, and we disclosed it to both of our underwriters, investment bankers. They were not able to sell the bonds. They would not have been able to sell the bonds in the open market. And so for that reason, you know, we had discussions with the board that there's really nothing we can do. There's no market for the bonds with the lawsuit.
Well, did they take it out, or were they afraid to take it out?
Well, I think from their point of view, there wasn't really a decision to make. They knew they couldn't market the bonds, and we could not get legal comfort that we would be able to pay interest. I mean, the risk on the lawsuit was such that, however small the risk was, no one wanted to take it, because if the litigants were successful and they said, well, the district doesn't have to pay interest or principal on those bonds, we didn't have the authority to issue them, then the bondholders would have been stuck, and no one wants to take that risk.
Okay, on the potential bonds, so we're looking at Unit 3 and also facilities, is that correct?
On the next two issues, it's strictly, or 2+ issues, strictly for the El Centro Unit 3 repowering. We have in our forecast over the next 5 years that we need to borrow $300 million, and 150 plus of that will be for the El Centro Unit 3. Most of the rest will be for distribution. There could be some for transmission.
Okay, and then we also have I had one other item. Is there any transmission? Does that include transmission build out?
It may. We're probably going to try to limit it just to distribution, so that there's no question as to whether there's any private use.
Okay, but in here on the off-balance, the off-balance sheet, which included San Juan, there's also some potential environmental issues there. Is that correct?
I'll let Dr. Koch address that.
Always did.
Dr. Koch?
Yes, sir. With the EPA decision in November of last year to require additional environmental compliance at the San Juan facility, there is the potential for up to $40 to $50 million in additional costs for SCRs. That seems low to me. 50%, it's $260 million. We're 25%, so say 75 to 80 million in additional environmental compliance at the San Juan facility. If we were to go forward with that, or if SCAPA were to go forward with that on behalf of the district, then the cost would go into, SCAPA would go out for a bond, SCAPA would upgrade the facility, the environmental, and then pass the cost on to us. Now, we're looking at a variety of different alternatives, which include non-catalytic recovery, the SCRs, conversion of some of the plant from coal to natural gas, and other alternatives. I believe the next meeting between SCAP and PNM is in about 3 weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, and PNM is meeting with EPA on a more frequent basis, although I don't know the exact date right now. The decision will be made sometime in the late spring or early summer of what we have to do. I imagine PNM would challenge it for no other reason than we would like a 5-year rather than a 3-year compliance period, which is common But at this point, we don't know what EPA will end up doing. So yes, there will be additional cost. There will be additional cost. How much additional cost, we don't know, and we're attempting to mitigate it.
Are you afraid to make a ballpark guess?
I'm more than happy to send the board. We've done an analysis. I shipped it off to the bond council just yesterday, Jeff. It was either yesterday or Friday, to our bond council, just so that they could start putting into our exposed liabilities. I have no problem. I think it'll end up costing us between $3 and $5 million extra per year. I don't know which of the alternatives.
Yeah, how much did you say?
$3 to $5 million per year. $5 million if we have to put SCRs in an accelerated pattern. It can be almost nothing if we can put in non-selective catalytic recovery in 5 years and anywhere in between. But it's not a call that the district is going to make. It's going to be something that PNM as project manager and EPA tell us to do. And our hope, I would like to see us out of coal into a combination of coal and natural gas would be my preference. But we're going to do whatever the other cities and ourselves decide upon.
And thank you, Mr. Pope. In looking at the off-balance sheet, the interest amount, it looks like it's considerably less than the bonds. What's the cause of that, percentage-wise?
Well, Palo Verde and San Juan are being paid off sooner than some of the other outstanding debt we have. So there's going to be less interest associated with those payments and more principal associated with them.
Pay downs quicker than.
Yeah.
Any other questions, Director Hanks?
I just had one more on the, and it's not related exactly to debt and liabilities, but in our investment portfolio, do you have an amount for water and for energy that we currently have invested?
Yes, we do. And I don't know it off the top of my head, but I can get you the.
Okay, thank you.
What I can do is we'll get it for you as of the end of December.
Okay.
If that's okay.
Combined, what are you?
Well, we'll have it separate and combined.
Okay. Ballpark figure? Number?
Well, let me go through I have it in my briefcase.
All right.
And I can get it for you.
Okay.
Director Desert?
Yeah, Mr. Broking, on the other post-employment benefits of 180 million, almost 181 million, almost, for the energy, is that in line with an agency the size of the IID? Is a similar question that we had over the water. Is that in line with where we should be?
I'll answer it this way, that what the district provides is greater benefit than most all other public entities. And the reason I say that is that we provide retirement benefits not only to the employee but to dependents. Most organizations only provide that benefit to the employee.
So, and also then the actuary report that we had that finished up here March 3rd, as compared to the one 2 years ago, is that number very similar as it was in the water department?
I believe it is. I don't think the number was all that different.
Yeah, the water department was within $1 million, I think you said, and then so we should be almost within $2-3 million here of whatever.
I think so. But when we make the presentation in a month or so, we can show you the comparison between the last study and this study, and you'll have the exact number.
Okay, and the successful bonding that we went out and did in February for what, $78 to $80 million?
That's $78 million, yes.
That was we were did a good job there. We were successful at that.
Yes, our underwriters I think did an excellent job. It was because of the lawsuit at the time was still pending. It was investors were a little nervous, but I would have to say the underwriters did a great job of explaining the situation, and it was well received.
And so the lawsuit did impact what rates we received there. We could have got even better.
I don't think the lawsuit, based on the work that the underwriters did, had much, if any, of an impact on what we paid on that particular day.
And how many months prior to that was the Build America bond deadline?
Well, the Build America bonds, the opportunity to issue those bonds went away at the end of last year, December 31, I believe. I think we got authorization from the board last June, May or June, to do those the BAB bonds.
And do you know when the lawsuit began?
It was around June or July, as I recall.
It was within a short time after we adopted the resolutions in June.
Immediately afterwards.
Thank you.
I just have a follow-up on Mr. Director Desert's question. I'm not sure if your question was per capita on the pensions. Does it average out, or were you asking the question, is it better than everybody else's, or were you asking?
I was asking as a similar question that I did in the water department. Is it in line for an agency the size of the IID? And Greg, you're right. I am fully aware that the benefits that the IID pays is substantially better than many in most agencies. But I just want to make sure that we're in line with where we've been historically, that number isn't a surprise, that it isn't some kind of phantom debt out there that we're maybe associated to some other kind of a portion of our power rate or ECA rate, as we'll get into a future discussion here in just a little while.
We can get there. Director Hanks?
Yeah, on the ECA presentation, you said you had more information for us. Are you going to get into the debt ratio with us and the maximum load?
Yes, I can discuss that, and I will discuss that. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. One last question. For a utility the size of the IID, our debt ratio compared to our income and so forth, is that within the industry, what they consider good business practices?
Yes, right now we have a debt to equity ratio of around, I think, 38% or maybe low 40s. Our goal by board policy is to have it between 40 and 60%. After, if we do all these proposed financings, we'll still be within the board direction of keeping that debt to equity under 60%. Our coverages have been very strong over the last few years. We try to, we're trying to maintain at least 2 times coverage for our direct debt. We've exceeded that the last several years, even when factoring in what we've deferred and put in the rate stabilization fund. So the last 2 years have been extremely successful. I'm a little frustrated on how low I think we're getting rated by the rating agencies. I think we deserve a higher rating, but we're going to keep pushing the issue, and if we keep showing the numbers, I think at some point we will get an upgrade that we deserve.
Okay, if that's done, then we will move. Oh, Mr. Hanks, please come forward.
Orby Hanks, Raleigh, California. While I was sitting there listening and doing a little bit of figuring and whatever, sometime back I presented the board with a handwritten sheet asking questions about the long-term debt. The estimate there was $1.9 billion, and we left out some other things that could have put it further. And what I was looking for, we were told we would have an answer sometime in March. That did not come around, and then I assume that this is a part of that answer. Now, here with the water and the power, we have $1.3 billion in debt. Now, if we take some of these things that we're going to do or we're planning on doing, we're going to pick up about $430 million for the power division and refurbishing Unit 3, which needs it very badly. If we're going to quadruple our output, then we're going to need some more lines to do that, another $150 million. And then we're talking about in the water department, going back to that $300 million project with the water. That puts us up to 750. Put that together and we're over $2 billion in debt. Now, my question is, I heard a question asked, but didn't get the answer. How much are we as ratepayers going to have our power bill and our water bill increase to cover that $2 billion long-term debt? That's not going to go away by refinancing or whatever. It just adds to it and adds to the interest. It's time that we would like to have some answers. And those are just off-the-cuff figures. Now, something that seems to be hidden in this scenario, we're talking about employee benefits, pension plans. If we lay off 300 people, boy, we can clear out about $400 million. Is that where we're headed? Transparency would certainly help, because I think we've got an awful lot of good employees that are out there hanging by their fingernails just to see what happens. And if we run this debt up too high, somebody's got to go. And I hate to see it, us people that are on the bottom end getting shafted again. The employees have had a problem with their pension plan or something. I don't quite understand it. But I think to do it again would be disastrous. And if that is part of this plan and part of it, I would hope that it would come out so that the community knows where our district is headed. I may be wrong, but the figures are there. I hope you would take it into consideration. Thank you.
Mr. Hanks. Mr. Brokey? Mr. Abadi, did you have a comment?
Thank you, President Mendoza. Mike Abadi, El Centro. Reiterating what Mr. Hanks just said, is going through the debt service. You have somewhat of a short-term debt of looks like about $20 million between CP and a few other things, and interest on the water side, just on the water side. How long can you carry over short-term debt in a CP before you call it long-term debt? Some of this stuff has been carried over more than 5 years, I think.
Mr. Brooklyn,
4
would you
years.
come forward and answer, please?
Well, the current program is for 3 years. We have a letter of credit for 3 years. So we could carry that over 3 years before we take it out. And if we weren't able to get a new letter of credit, then we'd either have to issue long-term debt or use reserves to pay off what we had in the CP program.
So the total 15 million is all less than 3 years old? Current that's happened there's nothing prior to 3 years old?
I don't know. There might be some that's been outstanding as possibly as 4 years, because we did extend the commercial paper program last year. I'd have to look and see how long that has been outstanding. But as I mentioned earlier, it's no longer $15 million. It's between 6.5 and 8.5 million.
You have, on your CP paper, what interest rate are you paying compared to the 45 million you have set aside that you're earning on that 4 to 5 million set aside?
Well, right now, what we're paying on CP ranges from about 0.2% to 3%. I think the last go around was about 0.3% is what we paid. The 45 million is, what 45 million are you talking about?
You said you had 45 million set aside in the water?
Well, we have received 50 million from the water, San Diego County Water District. By agreement, we have to invest that in tax-exempt proceeds, and I think we're probably earning something around 1% or less on that.
The interest earned on that, would that be encompassed if there was a clawback program? Would they get the interest on that money being made, or we would get the interest on top of anything less than what the clawback would require?
The interest is ours to keep. Right now, we're entitled to $18 million. So if the agreement was terminated today, contract canceled, we'd have to return $32 million, but we keep all the interest that we've earned.
On your lease and vehicles and your surplus, you don't buy vehicles because you bought them because you thought you need them, didn't need them, call them surplus. Is that the reason for leasing now? It's easy not to know what you lease, just lease a whole bunch of them. Then you got no surplus deal. But wouldn't it be nice to use, if you look at your total between leasing and all that sales from your surplus that you're talking, to have a policy in place to offset some of the short-term debt, reduce that debt ratio. Look at your computers. Your computers are $4 million a year. Oh, fuck. Are we leasing them because we're not sure what we need? But I turned it off. Well, we're not buying them? On the power side, looking at San Juan, we talked about retrofitting, which is a big liability, a total liability of $70-something million, I believe Dr. Cloak said. Who does the cost-benefit analysis on that would be the motivating factor on decision-making on whether to retrofit natural gas or to retire?
Actually, on behalf of SCAPA, IID has taken the lead in conjunction with Navigant. So we're going to make a recommendation to SCAPA. SCAPA will make a recommendation to PNM. Ultimately, it's PNM's call.
At 25% ownership, we're taking the lead?
We are the largest SCAPA participant. Therefore, of the SCAPA participants, we are taking the lead, yes.
I still don't understand why we're carrying so much debt when the public gets in the books, your monthly deal, and I know CFO tracks it. You have a little over $26 million sitting at SCAPA, and why do we continue to carry debt at a high interest rate, whether it's COP or whatever liability we have when you have this cash sitting there, is foolish to me. Why ask to collect more from the ratepayer, especially on the water side in 2021 or whatever? Why not head that off, be a little more proactive? And but for what reason? Can I ask the $10 reduction in the fallowing deal from 85 to 75 that happened a little over a year ago? What happened to that money? That was a proactive move on the board's part to get ahead of making that 2021 water increase. Was that put into rate stabilization, or is the same? Or are the goals the same in both departments? Thank you.
Mr. Broking? Would you answer his last question, please, Mr. Abadi's question regarding the rate stabilization?
Well, there's no rate stabilization monies for the water department, but we have been tracking the difference between the 85 and the 75 as to how much it saved, and I think we do show that on our monthly financials. At least we did last year, I know.
And the comment that Mr. Hanks made, that the total liability and debt, which is over $2 billion, do you agree with that number?
Well, currently, I would say that our total debt is the $218 million principal and interest for water, and $900 million for energy. So that's about $1.1 million of debt service that we have to pay currently.
Mr. Abadi?
I disagree with Mr. Broking. The resolution called for weight stabilization and in all departments, organizational-wide, centralized services, water, and power. The only effort's been made in power through its collection. So why isn't the same effort being made through efficiencies for all departments? Because it was in a resolution and it was across the organizational-wide.
Gloria, can you forward a copy of the resolution to the board, please? Okay. Thank you. Okay, no more questions? We will go on to item number 11.
I just want to make one clarification. When Mr. Hanks came up and he mentioned about the 1.9 billion, whenever he had put those numbers together, there was, the board had adopted an additional $600 million worth of bonds that have been pulled back.
Okay, all right.
I have a question. Mr. Broking, the computer leases, vehicle leases, and the interest, that's $190,000 a year, or is that over a life?
No, what you see is the cumulative.
Which would
that's owed on
be-
those leases. I think most leases are 3-year leases, but
So
I don't think
that's
they're always.
1 year.
No,
No?
the numbers that you're seeing are cumulative for the entire lease period.
The same as the computer?
Yes, they're all cumulative interest and principal payments.
So the leases that you can say is average, if it's 20 or 30 years, it'd be $10,000, $20,000 a year?
The computers and the vehicles, I think, are on a 3-year cycle. So they're much shorter period than our long-term debt.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Okay, now we're going to move on to item number 11, page 84. Energy cost adjustment, Mr. Broking.
Were you willing to take a couple-minute break?
Okay, let's take a 3-minute break.
Okay.
And then we come back.
Thank you.
Director Mendel, we're going to start.
Everybody's very warm and loving today.
Lakers play at 7:30. I want to go home. Okay. Let's go. ECA?
Okay.
ECA. ECA cost adjustment.
This evening I'll talk about, well, before I talk about the agenda, this is for information. Next week what we'll be asking the board to approve is to deposit additional $46.5 million in the rate stabilization fund, increase the maximum limit that can be placed in the rate stabilization from 100 to 150 million, and for the board to select an option to move forward with the ECA for public hearings.
This is for the meeting of April the 19th?
That's
A week
correct.
from today?
That's correct.
Okay, all right.
And so this evening, we'll talk about the 2009 energy financial results, determination of how monies are calculated and deposited in the rate stabilization fund. We have 2010 energy preliminary financial results, the 2010 projected deferral. We'll have a couple slides on the ECA formula overview, calculation of the ECA rate historical, and then options. There are 3 options that we're presenting for the board's consideration. This is just a little history on how we calculated, well, not how we calculated, but what was deposited in the rate stabilization account in 2009. You'll see in the far right-hand column, that's $53.5 million. That's currently what's in the rate stabilization fund. When we do that, it lowers our net energy revenues for the year. It lowers our debt service calculations. Our goal is right now is around 2.5 for all debt and our direct debt, and around 2 times coverage for off-balance sheet and indirect. And as you can see, even with the adjustment of the $53.5 million, we still have very good coverages for the year. You'll notice that before the adjustment, we had $160 million in unrestricted cash. Afterwards, we had 106. That's because we moved $53.5 million from unrestricted to restricted. So after the adjustment, restricted goes up by the same amount, but total cash is the same. We still, at the end of 2009, we still had $247 million. And the way we calculated that, what we're trying to do, the reason for the deferral is to better match revenues with expenses. And Dr. Koch did an excellent job in 2009 and 2010 in driving actual power supply costs down below budgeted. So we did there's actually more involved in the calculation of cash, but we've just highlighted the impact of the power supply cost to make the calculation. So we come up with what's budgeted for the power supply for the year, back out wholesale gas sales and wholesale electric sales, come up with total net energy revenues. In 2009 revised budget was about $259 million. The actual audited number came in at about 205. Just subtracted one from the other, and that's the $53.5 million that was deferred in 2009. It's now in the rate stabilization fund.
Okay.
Similar type process for 2010. We're proposing $46.5 million. That would take us to the $100 million limit that the board currently has. Here again, strong coverages before and after the deferral, extremely strong. And as you can see, all we're doing is moving cash out of unrestricted and put it into the restricted for the rate stabilization fund, $254 million at the end of the year. And the same calculation that we used before. The deferral shows $49.5 million based on the calculation, but right now we're limited to $100 million, so we'd only move $46.5 million over into the rate stabilization fund if the board approves that. And these are our costs as a percentage of the average system rate. You can see our largest percentage is power supply cost at 48%, O&M at 30%, capital at 16%, and debt service at 6%. And that will vary from year to year, depending on the capital program and how much you finance of the capital program as to how much you pay out of your existing rates. And obviously also the fluctuation in power supply costs. Historically, that number has been higher. If you look back in 2008, 7, and 6, you'd see a much higher percentage for power supply than you do now. So this was the second item next week that we're going to ask the board to act on, and that's to increase the rate stabilization maximum limit from $100 million to $150 million. I know when we first started, I never really imagined that we would be in a position to put $100 million in, but we had the opportunity. You can do it. I'm not sure how we would get to $150 million, but I'd like the option if we were able to create those savings to do it. And now moving on to the energy cost adjustment. It's currently been frozen since 2008 by board action. It really exists in name only. We've had one rate in place since 2008. There's been two components, the base and the ECA. And the ECA is such that you can't go back and restate prior years. It's a forward-looking adjustment. So this is just the existing formula. I think it was approved back in 2002. I'm not going to try to explain that now, but it's the formula that we have on our books to calculate the ECA, and these are just the definitions associated with that. So this is a slide that shows historically, if it's for illustrative purposes only, if you had followed the formula, and I don't quite understand the formula, some of the things they're doing, but it's in our rate schedule. So if we did follow that formula, you would start off with power supply cost, you'd back out your fixed power supply cost, which are pretty much your premiums, your falling water charge, and your capacity payments. And then this is the part that I understand it, I don't understand. It's you're reducing the variable power supply costs basically by 1 cent per each kilowatt hour sold. I haven't really been given an explanation as how that ties in, because in my mind, all that is doing is reducing the amount of variable costs that are subject to an adjustment. But if you did that by the formula, those are, you can see it starts at 160 million and it's dropped down to 99 million by 2010. The next line item is the ECA revenue that shows how much we collected of ECA revenue over those years. So the line after that is the yearly overage or shortfall by year, and then the cumulative is begin from 2006 to 2010, based on this calculation, again for illustrative purposes, how much had been collected, and ECA had collected $128 million more than the cost based on this formula. And that's it's not exact to what we're proposing to put in the rate stabilization fund, but certainly in the ballpark. So we have three options that I want to discuss. It's my opinion that all these options are legal, and the board has the authority to implement any of them. I will say that when I talk about a floating ECA, and that's what all these options are, a floating ECA. If the board approves the increasing the rate stabilization account to $100 million, there won't be an ECA rate increase until that $100 million is used up. So we would have to basically use all $100 million before there could be a rate increase, even though, quote unquote, we're going to a floating ECA right now, or whenever the board approves it. And all of these options have that assumption. It's just some options would require a rate increase sooner than the other ones, based on how the initial starting points are calculated. So option one, again, is float the ECA. You would set the ECA rate based on the current ECA formula, which is what we discussed earlier with just current numbers. If the actual ECA rate, when calculated, is higher than the ECA formula rate above, you would use rate stabilization funds to offset the difference. And that's how, that's how we would address the ECA issue. Now, we would adjust the base rate for capacity cost above the component cost of energy. And what that means is that there would be a slight decrease in rates going forward if we use this option. The current average system rate is about 13.35 cents per kWh. If you did the math on this, and we're using 2011, so depending on when things are actually started and what period you use, these could change a little, but they're basically pretty much good for comparison purposes. That the ECA rate would be 4.19 cents, and that's based on 2011 numbers and going through this calculation where you start with power supply costs, back out fixed, back out variable, the variable portion based on the roughly 1 cent credit per kWh sales, and that becomes your ECA cost.
Mr. Brokey, what's the price right now, our cost per kilowatt that we're charging? With the ECA rate, the current ECA rate. And
current ECA rate is 5.01 cents.
And then that added to the base rate totals?
I think it totals, every system rate would be 13.35.
We're at 13.35 right now.
Right, thereabouts. So the ECA under this option would be 4.19 cents, which does not, it floats probably 75% of your variable cost. It floats none of your fixed costs and about 75% of your variable cost. And then the adjustment that...
What do you mean by float 75% of your variable costs? Where's the other 25%?
It is not going to be part of the ECA adjustment. Because of this formula, I'm saying if you follow this formula where it says less variable power supply cost, that's reducing the amount of variable cost that you're going to float or adjust for.
Because I think we're talking about the same thing, but I'm getting there in a different way. That's why I was asking you to explain it to me.
And so here again, this is the 2011 capacity costs were estimated at $50 million. If you back out roughly the 1 cent component cost is $31 million. So the net is $19 million. So we're adding the $19 million back to forecasted sales to the and that's 0.0059. Add that to the existing base rate number, and you come up with a base rate of 893, and based on the average system rate for 2011, it would be 1312.
So this proposal includes a base rate increase?
This, yes, has the base rate going up, the ECA going down, and the average system rate going down. So the ECA rate is going down faster than the base rate, which results in a slight decrease, roughly $7.3 million a year in revenue to the district.
A difference of how much revenue?
Roughly $7.3 million the first year.
Well, we'd still be adding money to our rate stabilization account of some $25 to $27 million with this formula.
Not necessarily, no. That's not the case.
Okay.
So option 2 is very similar to option 1. You still use the ECA rate based on the current ECA formula. If the ECA rate, when calculated, is higher than ECA formula rate above, use the rate stabilization funds to offset the difference. So here again, you used $100 million before there's an ECA rate increase. But then you adjust the base rate to keep the average system rate equal to the current rate, which is 1335, which I've been talking about. So you'll notice the 4.19 cents for the ECA is the same under option 1. And then all you're doing is taking the system rate in 2010, keeping it the same. And so your base rate is 916. And your starting point is the same as what you have at the end of 2010. Here the increase in the base rate offsets equally the decrease in the ECA rate, so that there's no rate increase starting
So
up.
there's no base rate increase, but there's a decrease in the ECA.
There is a base rate increase.
And this one too?
There's a base rate increase along with an ECA rate decrease, but the net rate is the same. So this option, starting off, provides more revenue than option number 1, which was a rate decrease. And then option 3 is a little different. We're getting away from the current formula that's on the books, and instead of floating roughly 75% of the variable costs, we would put the ECA would recover all power supply costs. We would eliminate the component cost of energy, roughly the 1 cent factor that we reduce the costs that are going into the ECA. The last bullet is the same as the other 2 options. If the actual ECA rate, when calculated, is higher than the ECA formula rate above, then we use rate stabilization funds to offset the difference, which is consistent. That is consistent with all 3 proposals. And then we adjusted the base rate to keep the average system rate equal to the current rates. So what this did was increase the ECA and decrease the base and kept it the same as the 2010 rate starting off. So 2 and 3 starting off has the same rate, but based on the formulas, and well, I'll get to this next. Option 1, when I say no downward adjustment to the ECA, that means over this period, 2011 to 2015, that if the formula calls for a rate decrease, but you don't do that, you keep it constant for the period, the 5-year period, would you need a rate increase? And you would need an increase on option 1 because you're starting off with the rate decrease, and that $7 million is cumulative over 5 years, so you're $35 million short over that period. Options 2 and 3 we're projecting not to require a rate increase, and if there was no downward adjustment. And I should say that when we're talking about rate stabilization money, it will be used to adjust for the ECA calculation, but we'll also need to use it to smooth our cash flows too over those years. And obviously we won't be able to do that without board approval, so we would be bringing that back to you. But we have that in our forecast to use rate stabilization money to, 1, meet debt coverage targets, or 2, to meet cash levels so that we keep our rating up. Okay, the second column, the downward adjustment to the ECA, that if, I think between years 12 and 13, we're projecting an ECA rate decrease. If that was to occur and the board did adjust the ECA downward, then option 1 and 2 would require a rate increase. I think it's in 2015, but option 3 would still not require a rate increase for the period. And really the reason is it's
when you talk about rate increase, you're talking about base rate increase,
talking about
right?
total rate increase to the ECA, and possibly a base rate increase too. Yes.
Well, I need to know which one are you talking about.
Well, I can.
You need to separate.
I can give you the totals because the option 1 under the worst case scenario, if there was a downward adjustment, you would probably need in 2015 anywhere from a 12 to maybe an 18% rate increase.
Total or base
Total.
to the base? To both.
Total.
Total.
Yeah.
Which would basically belong to the base, right? Because we're recouping our power supply costs.
We're recouping them because we're getting our rate stabilization fund. So once the rate stabilization funds goes away, the ECA would adjust, and we would start collecting it. But if that wasn't enough to collect it, then we'd have to have a base rate increase.
Any other questions? Go on.
As I mentioned earlier in the other presentation, obviously we have a lot of assumptions and forecasts in this scenario. We've tried to keep them, and I think we have kept them, all the costs consistent. So each option has the same amount of debt, each option has the same amount of cost. The only thing that really changes is the revenue and the years that it's received. And what's causing the difference is how what the ECA starting point is and what is being floated for or adjusted for the ECA. So, from staff's point of view, from my point of view, one thing that I think I mentioned before is one of my goals is to keep rates as stable and predictable as possible, so that if you didn't want to have the downward adjustment to the ECA, then option 3 would be the best option, not having to raise rates to the customers over the period. If you wanted, obviously, if you did want to adjust the rate, give the customers a 1 or 2 year benefit, then, you know, that's also a viable option, but it would result in a larger increase later on. So that's really, in my mind on this is, you know, how the board wants to go. Do they want to go with stable rates, or would they like to have a rate decrease now with the likelihood of a larger increase later on?
Well, Greg, I mean, I think you need to put it more like you can either have a larger increase later on or cut expenses. You don't have to have the larger increase. I think you have to throw that in there because that decision is for the board to make, whether we want to cut expenses or have a larger increase.
Go on to the timeline.
And the timeline is next week. We're hoping to get direction from the board as to which option they like, or other options that they may want us to set for a public hearing. We would set those public hearings in June. We would have a 30-day notice in May. We have the ECA presentation May 2nd, the June 7th rate hearing in La Quinta, following week in El Centro, and we would bring it back for the 21st of June for board approval, and then we would implement it, I think, July 1st. So that's...
Okay, now, questions or comments from this board? Director Hanks?
Yeah, I'd like to start first with the resolution. I have some clarification I need regarding the this resolution.
Okay.
My question is this. Does this resolution permit the rate stabilization fund to be used for any purpose other than offsetting the ECA cost components?
Yeah, the rate stabilization fund, according to my understanding, can be used for any lawful purpose of the district. The board just, a majority of the board would have to vote to use that money, though.
All right, so all the money that's going into the rate stabilization fund passes through the balance account into the rate stabilization fund.
It doesn't really pass through any account. It just it doesn't pass through the ECA. We just take it from reserves and put it into the rate stabilization fund. But it correlates to what, if we had floated the ECA, it correlates to what that number over the last few years.
Well, that's my point. It's my understanding that all the money that goes into the rate stabilization fund is a over-collection of the ECA that normally would go into a balancing account, and then by the end of the year, we have a true-up on our rates, up or down, was over-collection, under-collection. But if it's going into a rate stabilization fund, that removes the classification of a restricted fund.
No, it's still restricted because it's restricted by board action. If the board takes no action, that $100 million stays there forever.
But my point is this: the current ECA goes into a balancing account, and when it's isolated in the balancing account, it can be used for no other purpose other than to offset the ECA rates.
Right, and there wouldn't, if we had a true ECA where we adjusted it either monthly, quarterly, or semi-annually, there would be no cash to talk about, because if rates went down, then if the cost went down, the rates would be lower, and the district would have collected less money.
And the board hasn't voted to float it, although if you go back and check the minutes, that's exactly what we promised the ratepayers we were going to do. That once the revenues exceeded the cost of fuel, we would float it. But we haven't done that.
Right, it hasn't been floated yet. That's correct.
Okay. Then I'd also like to point out And so let's start with option one. And it also applies to option two. Maybe even option three. I'll have to look at that one again. When you look at our existing ECA of 5.01 cents per kilowatt hour, that was based on the price of fuel at a certain cost, which with the program we're currently in, we're doing much better. As a matter of fact, the amount that we wrote into the budget, that was adopted into the budget for power supply costs, was based on a 4.919 cents per kilowatt hour, which means in the ECA, it has an automatic built-in overcollection factor of 16.4%, starting out the gate, January 1st. It's already designed to overcollect. This does not include the fine work that we've been seeing out of our supply and trading people. Okay, this was the projected cost. The difference of 5.01 and 4.19 is 0.82. And if you notice on page well, you had referred to the 0.0099 factor,
Right.
as generating roughly 31 million.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So if we're looking at 0.84, we're not quite looking at, we're probably looking at what 26, 27 million projected overcollection to start out. One of the things that that is obvious, the capacity charges on page 103, page 15, the capacity charges of 50 million is not being covered by the base rate component covered with the 0.099 cents. We have a shortfall of 19 million. Correct?
That 31 million does not cover the 50 million. That's correct.
Yeah. So what we have a problem in the base rate of undercollection or underfunding, but we also have an overcollection problem in the ECA, and the ability to supplement or transfer these funds are limited. And whatever we do in developing a formula, we're going to have to take the time to correct these. And I think that's pretty much what you put down at the bottom of page 13, where you said adjust the base rate for capacity costs above component cost of energy. Make that thing. All right. Now, we also know we have some debt service coming up that's going to be an increase, and that's in the base rate. But my contention is this: in the ECA, if you float the ECA, it's automatically going to drop to 4.19 before you take into consideration any other additional work that's done by supply and trading to reduce costs, daytime trading and so forth.
Yeah, that's based on the current formula, based on 2011 budget. That would be the number.
Okay. Now, in the in the rate stabilization account that we're looking at, that has a cap of 100 million.
Yes.
Matter of fact, I remember when we talked about that, and I think Director Abadi's gone. I told him we'd have that much in 2 years. If my calculation was correct, and we're pretty close. Matter of fact, I think we're over. And the need to take it to 150 million by the end of 2011, we'll probably pretty much have that filled up, pretty close.
I hope.
Okay. Now, here's my concern. We have to keep this organization healthy. We can't, and I think Director Sanchez alluded to it, we can't just raise rates without achieving the efficiencies. And we've done, I think, an excellent job in the areas of efficiencies up to this point. We still have some, I call it low-hanging fruit. But we also have this debt service interest that is a monster. Now, whether you can call that low-lying fruit, I don't know whether it comes in that classification. But I think there needs to be a study done to see how best, if we're not going to just turn the 150 million back to the ratepayer through the old formula, we're going to use it. How best can we guarantee our rates by the utilization of this 150 million? My belief is, if you're not going to turn it back to the ratepayer, that you look at some way to use that instead of borrowing.
And in our forecast, we do that. We use that to pay for capital and to pay for increases in ECA. So by paying for capital, it reduces the need to borrow.
And if the money is used out of that account, okay, instead of borrowing, the principal has to be paid back because it belongs to the ratepayer.
Well, actually, when you take the money out of the rate stabilization fund, it's gone. The ratepayer doesn't pay it back; it gets use of it. Because once you take it out of the rate stabilization fund, you have to show that as revenue.
I wish you hadn't have told me that, because the way I see it, if it's going to be gone, you need to just turn it back to the public. But if you can use it and you can show the public that you're saving an equivalent amount over the duration of a bond of 150 million, and you're still going to get to keep your principal for future, I think you have a chance to sell that to the public. Now, maybe it doesn't work in this type of structure. Maybe it needs to be in some other type of fund. I don't know. You're the accountant.
No, I think it's in the right structure. It's just that when you take it out, you're going to pay an expense with it. That's really the only purpose of taking it out. And it's as I mentioned earlier, it's whatever.
Where if you were borrowing a bond, you'd have to pay the bondholders back. So if you're borrowing from the ratepayers, why not pay them back? And you don't have to pay any interest. The payment of the interest is a benefit to the ratepayer.
But unfortunately, the way the rate stabilization fund is set up and following generally accepted accounting principles, that's you don't borrow off. It's not like you can borrow against your 401k and pay yourself back. Once you take it out, you apply it as revenue and use it for an expense, either to reduce borrowing or pay for increased power cost or whatever else the board deems desirable.
I think if you're going to take it and it's not going to come back to the ratepayer, I think my position is going to be then we need to use it to pay back the components that it was charged for in the rate stabilization fund. In the ECA. And the ECA did not include the capacity costs, and it did not include falling water charge. And there needs to, and what I don't understand is how we can pay for those charges, but we can't pay for a debt, pardon me, a bond, equivalent of a bond. But we can pay capacity, and we can pay flowing water charges with it.
What you're paying for is not having to borrow. That's really how the money's being used.
Well,
You're paying cash for capital and not having to borrow that money, so that's what you're saving.
What I'm getting at, Mr. Brokeen, there was no board action to permit paying of capacity or flowing water charge with those funds from the ECA. Whether they should have been included in an ECA is another matter, and whether we need to adopt a formula, that's another matter. But in terms of what the rates were, what the rules were of collection, that part hasn't changed. When we look at telling the public that the rates stay the same, their out-of-pocket money stays the same. But if we have some built-in factors that already are designed for an over-collection, and you're establishing a formula further out, you have compounded those over-collections into your formula. But the bottom line is, for your position, how do we pay for this? How do we generate these funds? Okay? We should have floated this a couple of years ago. Now it's kind of created its own problem for us. It's a good problem, but it's a problem. It helps us with our bonding ability. Whenever you go to buy bonds, if someone goes to buy bonds and they look at your portfolio and you have $150 million surplus, I'm sure that, and where our
That
bond
gets their
people kept
attention.
telling us, you got to have the will to and this was 3 years back, they kept telling us, you got to have the will to raise rates. And this board said, well, what's the difference of being efficient and gaining those revenues, which is exactly what we've done, instead of raising rates. At one time, they were telling us 6% on the base rate and 6% on the ECA. And we've exceeded that by not changing the rates. They stayed the same. And we have built up extra funds. Okay, the question is, how do we use those funds? Who do they belong to? What are the restrictions on it? And that scares me. As a board member, it scares me how we use those funds, and that we follow the proper protocol because in my mind, it's restricted and it should be used just for ECA components.
Do you have a comment, Mr. Kelly?
Director Hanks, as you know, as the board knows, this process has been going on for some time, and it's one that the board and staff have frankly struggled with. Your premise that the rate stabilization fund is necessarily designed for the benefit of the ratepayer is one I believe that Mr. Broking agrees with.
That's correct.
So really the distinction is how do we take the rate stabilization fund and use it for projects that benefit the ratepayer, and is it structured in such a way that it can be replenished? I mean, that's what you're disagreeing about, right?
I'm not sure.
Well, what he's talking about, I think, is that if we use it for in place of borrowing, that that we ought to pay it back.
Yes, and we're not going to be allowed to do it that way based on generally accepted accounting principles.
Okay, Director Sanchez?
Yeah, as being on the board, director of the board, I have to look at factors such as the economy and try to make the best decision for Imperial County. That's what we're elected to do. For example, one of the biggest reasons that I personally allowed to continue the rate stabilization fund to grow is to protect us from a double dip recession. And now you have two different voices saying, one, we're out of a recession, unemployment's going down, but then we just got out of the largest stimulus package November of last year. This year we'll know and see what happens if the stimulus package worked or didn't work. So the rate stabilization would still be, in fact, important. I think that, so in effect, I allowed it to grow to protect us from the Great Recession. Not that I'm agreeing with this particular option, and I agree with Director Hanks that it is established to an overcollection, but as well as it established for an undercollection. You get both. So it kind of evens out, and I think we kind of want to steer away from that, in my opinion. I have a question. Did we borrow, because there's a question asked, should we use some of the money to pay for capacity? Did we borrow for capacity to pay it back, or was it in the base and it was paid for and it's already done as far as well, that could be a convoluted question. I'll go to my next point. Is I also agree with Director Hanks that I like to see the ECA fund designed for ECA. For example, if we have a disruption like Katrina or something like that, to use those funds there. I'm not necessarily in agreement that if we need to borrow for a line and our debt service is going to go up by $1 million a year, and we take out money from there to cover that debt, I think that needs to be in the debt service ratio, or in the base rate. So I do agree with him on that one. Or we can structure the $100 million in some kind of 70% for natural disasters, any influx in power supply, and the other ones in debt service ratio, because it will offset supply. I mean, I'm kind of leaning toward, but there's two reserves though, right? There's your cash reserve, right, and your rate stabilization. So your cash reserve should be the reserve that you pull for more spending, so to speak, outside disruptions or natural disasters that I think the ECA rate stabilization should only be allowed for.
Well, the $100 million that we roughly have in unrestricted reserves, we're trying to maintain that, because that's one of the things the rating agencies look at for. They look for liquidity. So we don't want to drop it down to where we had in 2005 or 2006, because it's way too low. I mean, it doesn't have to be right at $100 million, but we want to have it near $100 million, or otherwise we'll start impacting our rates or our ratings, which will impact our borrowing costs.
So it is at $100 million now?
It's in the 90s. I'm not sure it's quite 100, but
and I'll tell you, it's higher than that.
Well, what is it?
Well, I should say right now it's higher than that.
What do we have,
There's a reason it needs to go to 150 million.
Right now, before any movement to the rate stabilization fund, there's about 140 million. So if we move the 46.5 million into the rate stabilization fund, your unrestricted would drop a little below 100 million.
You're collecting money from a restricted source, and you're moving it into an account that gives flexibility to use it however you want to. But in the public's eye, they think it's restricted money, and they think it's coming back to them to help offset their rates.
What is stopping us from incorporating language that would allow us to borrow out of the rate stabilization account and then pay it back to ourselves?
There's nothing you can do to do that. I mean, if we took it out of the other account, $100 million account, we could pay it back. Well, it's a different account. It's a deferred revenue account, and we need to, when we take it out, we need to show it as income.
Well, can we change from a deferred revenue account to the same kind of reserve account as the 100 million that we talked about a little earlier that we could then borrow out of and pay it back to?
Going forward, yes, you could do that.
Well, I agree with Director Hanks that we need to be able to use that money, those revenues, 100 million, 116 million, up to 150 million, to both borrow from to say finish Unit 3, pay it back, and then if we need to use it in the near future to subsidize rates, to give it back to the ratepayer for the ratepayer benefit, then we do that also.
Well, there's not enough money in that account to fund the remaining cost for the El Centro Unit 3 repowering.
Do another 78 million like we did in February, though.
Well, we would have to, yes.
And generally, that's probably kind of the direction we were going on the Unit 3. We were taking on in steps at a time. We weren't going to.
That's correct.
We weren't going to take it all on at one time. So
right.
I mean, having $100 million or $100 million plus dollars there is substantial to our next phase of development for Unit 3.
Well, how do you pay it back once it's used, and how do you pay it back other than through rates, putting surplus back into the rate stabilization fund?
The same way you pay your bonds back. Exactly the same way.
You know, in listening to the discussion from this board, it seems to me that perhaps the 19th is not enough time for us to make a decision. I think we need to have more discussion. Is that the consensus of this board? Do you want to move forward for a decision on the 19th?
If we don't move decision on the 19th, I like to bring a policy back that's anything over $100 million, we give it a form of a credit back, effective immediately, back to the ratepayers. Because we've been dilly-dallying this for 6 months, and that ECA rate stabilization has been growing. I've allowed it. I didn't want to do anything with up to $100 million, but anything over $100 million, I'm going to vote against the debt ceiling, to rates to $150 million. I mean, anything over that, I think should be back to a form of credit because we have to remind ourselves that the people of California did vote as well for green energy, and that takes a lot of money, which is why I'm not going to vote for any form of credit less than $100 million, because we need that for green energy rates, and green energy is expensive, and that's what the people of California voted for.
Okay. Well, bring this back on the 19th, but Mr. Kelly, when you work on the agenda, make sure that we have enough time to devote to this issue, because there's still a lot of discussion. Perhaps the agenda could be lighter for the 19th, because it looks to me like we're going to have more discussion. Okay?
I have something I'd like to read in for the record.
Sure.
I want to be on record again and stating the funds placed in the rate stabilization fund and funds involved in cost shifting, including capacity charges and falling water charges, are funds that should have been credited to and then transferred by board action from the public energy balancing account. Proper accounting and future availability for return transfer to the balancing account to credit the ratepayers' future under collection must be maintained and accurate. As recommended in the grand jury report, the current fixed ECA is not a properly functioning or adjusting ECA. It needs to be aligned. The board must align the formula to match the management's unbridled process, or develop a new formula at rates to provide adequate financial coverage of costs moving forward, or float the board-approved ECA formula as promised to the ratepayers as stated in the board minutes. Admittedly, the base rate is underfunded as staff continues business as usual and under collection of CSPs, failure to correct non-technical system losses, utilization of unnecessary outside contractors over employees, and interest on borrowing. And that's not to dismiss the progress that they have made. They have made excellent progress, and it's reflected in that rate stabilization fund. Any and all proposals short of floating the board-adopted formula and process constitutes a rate increase and requires a rate hearing regardless of how it's sugar-coated and sold. The creation and continued increase in the rate stabilization fund cap is the only financial vehicle or stopgap that prevents misappropriation of funds. And then only if unauthorized cost shifting is correctly accounted to the RSF for eventual payback to the balancing account for future under-collection credit to the ratepayers. My recommendation is still the same, that proper accounting of the overcollection, that's the rate stabilization fund plus cost shifting plus current balancing account for the years 2009, 2010, 2011, and by board action, place it in an RSF and adjust the cap accordingly. Using board-adopted ECA, float and adjust the ECA. Complete the efficiencies that are noted above and adjust the base rate to cover costs. Whatever the methodology chosen moving forward, the ratepayers are owed or credited an amount calculated of overcollection from March 7, 2006 to the present. A straightforward audit using the board-adopted ECA formula and component factors must be provided as a true-up to form the baseline moving forward. The Rate Stabilization Fund is a spillway reservoir to capture the overflow of ratepayer revenue even after unauthorized cost shifting the base rate components. The need to keep raising the cap verifies an overcollection. In summary, I have as a board advisor to the Finance Committee, as a participating elected director at the various board meetings as reflected in the official minutes, and in private emails and meetings with appropriate staff discuss my concerns. If proper accounting and authorized board action under any methodology chosen by this board is not accepted and followed by the staff, and the unauthorized process and practice by staff is continued or is not corrected, then we should expect some form of action, either legal or political, against the board and management of the IID. Through my years of training, experience, and understanding, I know that it is not sufficient on my part to believe that a no vote is the limit of my fiduciary responsibility to report actions I deem legally inappropriate. As a result, I have asked to meet with the interim general manager, legal counsel, and the board president to make one last effort to correct an ill-advised process, in my opinion, that may be and probably is unlawful or at a minimum unethical. You know, the debt service that we find ourselves in, it forced drastic action upon this CFO. And it is contingent upon this board to make the proper decisions and to give him the tools that he needs. To have him come continuously 13 or 14 times to this board without making a decision is not fair to anyone, not fair to the ratepayer, and not fair to the CFO. It's time that we correct this and move on. You know, one of the important steps that we took was that we refused as a board to continue inefficiencies and just handle them through rate increases. And as a board and as a staff, we've made tremendous progress in that. And we have a $100 million, $150 million looking us in the face to prove it. But we have reached this point where we're not moving forward or backwards. And at some point in time, it has to end. It has to make a decision. And I would suggest everyone go back, look through the minutes, what was promised when we fixed the ECA, and remember this, the ECA is fixed at an amount that is considerably higher than what we're paying for fuel prices now. If it goes up, it will take care of itself if it's floating. You won't have to come back. The CFO won't have to come back and ask the board, how are we going to cover these costs? Because a floating ECA will take care of it. And at some point in time, as our portfolio changes with renewables, those renewables are going to be in the ECA, and it will ratchet up and down. But currently, we have expenditures in the base rate with insufficient funds to cover those, including our debt service, while on the other hand, our ECA, we have a $150 million surplus. It's time to align the revenue with expenditures. It's not a case of pointing a finger at somebody, but we can't get ourselves in trouble by using the funds and commingling them. We've got to have a process that straightens that out. Thank you.
Okay, well, with that, I
well-
think we, pardon me, Director Menville.
Yeah, Mr. Brokin, you made a statement earlier that you don't quite understand the formula. Would you expound upon that, please?
Sure. It's, if the intent is to just float the variable supply cost, then you would start with net power supply cost less your fixed power supply cost line item, and then you would have a number. But then, in addition to that, reducing that by $32 million, which I really don't understand what that is doing, because it's what it is doing. I understand what it's doing. I just don't understand why it's in there. You're ending up floating less than your variable supply cost. You're floating about 75% of them. But if I could, I just want to make one statement. As the CFO, I'm in the presentation of our financial statements in our annual audit, I'm not aware of any unlawful activity or unethical activity by anybody, not only in the finance department but in the district.
Okay, it seems to me that we're going to have more discussion, and this board needs to move and make a decision. So we'll bring this back on the 19th and give us enough time to discuss it again.
We will do that. I wonder if we couldn't, with your indulgence, President Mendoza, have this meeting that Director Hanks has called for, because I really would like to see. I know there are 5 board members who want a floating ECA, and for some time that's been the case. We ought to be able to get there.
Well, I think we don't need to raise base rates, but we can float the ECA down. And again, Director Hanks, I mean, you've called for a cap on the ECA, and I'm willing to do that today if you want.
I'm sorry.
You're calling for a cap on the ECA stabilization fund. I'm willing to do that today if you want, of $100 million.
Well, this is for information, it's not for action. So, Director Hanks, you asked for another meeting to discuss this?
No, I just asked for a private meeting to discuss my concerns with
Okay.
legal.
Why don't you do that, and then if you're ready, we'll bring it back on the 19th. If not, we'll delay it for the meeting, the first meeting in May or something like that. Okay, because we can keep on discussing it, and yes?
Yeah, I mean, so what we're talking about is like an internal task force that we're working on the ECA with you, Mr. Kelly?
Actually, I just would like to have this meeting so that we can drive down on these issues that Director Hanks has raised and has repeatedly raised.
Would you like to meet with him at the meeting as well?
Well, I think two directors could be there, but I'd also like to encourage Mr. Garber, Mr. Campbell, Mr. Cloak, Mr. Brokin, everybody that's worked on this ECA formula, ECA presentation today and in the past few months.
Well,
our whole team.
Actually, I think we understand where the disconnect is here. And we've tried to anticipate this, and we've failed to this point. We ought to be able to get the president, Director Hanks,
Perfect.
the general counsel, Mr. Broking, Mr. Koch, Mr. Campbell, everyone who's worked on this to this point in a room.
Good idea. Well, set up the meeting
I'd
and
like to
let
make
us
a
know.
comment, one last comment. I mean, Director Hanks has,
You guys aren't going to turn the lights out on me, are
has
you?
been,
Yeah.
has interesting points, but I believe, I haven't heard anything different from his points from last September. And I think we've given ample amount of time to be able to hear him, either with staff or in the board. I think this board needs to take action. The last 6 months that we haven't taken action, the ECA rate stabilization has gone up over $100 million.
You're absolutely right. We need to bring this back a week from today. If we can, at the president's call.
We'll set up the meeting as soon as possible so we can meet Director Hanks and I can meet with you and your staff. Okay, having said that, let's move on to item number 12, page 110 on your agenda. This is transmission service charges for variable energy resources. Mr. Coke, this is action.
I'll move for approval.
Is there a second?
Second.
Second?
I got one question.
Well, we need, yeah,
Okay. So this is based on a pro rata of capacity, right?
Good evening, directors. I'm Dave Koch, the Assistant General Manager, Energy. It's not a pro rata, sir. What I'm attempting to do here is make sure that the capacity charge covers any operational cost of the transmission system. So as long as we can cover O&M and any associated debt with our debt associated with transmission built for generation, then I'm willing to drive the capacity cost down as low as I can.
Okay.
so this change in the charge is not going to impact the ratepayers.
That is correct, madam. That this rate, which is developed for generators, must recover the cost of building, owning, and maintaining a transmission system for the benefit of those generators. So as we can drive it down. We are foregoing revenue at some point in the future that we would otherwise be entitled to.
But it won't affect the ratepayers, not.
But it does not affect, it does not make the
O&M or
ratepayers
whatever.
better or worse off. No, it does
Okay.
not.
And you're not taking action to create the charge yet, but to express your opinion that you want energy staff to move forward on that task, and that you want the world to know that.
Yeah, I've got a question for Mr. Koch. If these lines aren't built and we're bypassed, and we keep saying, well, we don't want any impact on the ratepayers. Okay?
That's correct,
I think
sir.
that's a little misleading the way we say it, because if we don't build it, the building, so you say, well, we didn't impact the ratepayers. But if you lose your balance and control area, now what impact did you put on your ratepayers?
That's correct. That there's two reasons for building these lines. One, we are required to. There is no doubt that the district has an obligation under federal law to build these lines. The question is, how do we pay for these? What we have proposed through our transmission expansion plan is that the generators put up the money, so there's no capital at risk from the district, that this variable rate drives down the rate as much as possible to the generators but covers all O&M costs, and then over time pays back the generators for the money that they have fronted. So we're attempting as much as possible. Now, if we do have a entity that comes in and bypasses us, okay, at that point, since we haven't put up any dollars, and the generator has, because the generators put up the money, we owe somebody money that would be recovered under this rate. A generator cannot leave our system and go to another system and just say, you owe us money. They're paid back in terms of credits. So if they pay $85,000 a month, they're not going to get $85,000 in cash. They're going to get a credit against their bill. So over time, to the extent that a generator leaves, they will never be repaid back for their initial capital investment. And ultimately, the district will recover those funds. Will retain ownership of those lines with no additional cost to the generator.
You want to see if any of the generators have any comment before?
Any comments from the generators? No? Let's vote. Okay, thank you, Dr. Koch. Moving on to item number 14, page 114. Mrs. Shields, you're taking this? No, that's...
13.
I am on
Following.
page 13. Item 13, page 113 on your agenda.
I'll move for approval.
Second.
Well, do you want to just
We just want to kick off the following program contracting process. If you give us your approval at the $75 rate, then we'll start next week.
You have it. Please vote. Okay. Moving on, page 114, item 14 on your agenda. With Mr. Gomez, you're the presenter.
Yes, we are bringing to you for approval the amendment to an existing agreement we had with the Bureau of Reclamation. And I mean, I have a little history, but you know, you're aware of the earthquake, you know what happened, you know where we are getting up to this point. So the reason why we are bringing, what the agreement actually was in place is to allow the Bureau of Reclamation to create a project and work with the IID in order to provide technical assistance for the assessment, assist them with the solutions to the problems we had at the siphon in order to bring it up to pre-earthquake situation, I guess.
Well, I appreciate Mr. Kelly's bringing this forward to the board. I know that under the emergency protocol, doesn't have to, but I appreciate the transparency. So could I have a motion to approve?
I'll move for approval.
Is there a second? Please vote. Gloria, did you?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Did you want to have more discussion, Director Hanks?
Well, I thought it should have had a lot of discussion. That's why I voted no.
Well, this is, I know that we have issues with, but this is just, this particular item pertains to this contract. I share your concerns, but we discussed them at the last meeting, and we're not through discussing those concerns. But go on and state your concern.
The reason I voted no, I'll share that with you.
Sure.
I can't find any amounts in here, what it's for, how much it's for.
Says it's 5 million, and some of us.
No, I'm talking about the contract itself.
Been,
Is this not a contract with the Bureau?
It is.
Where is the monetary amount?
It's not stated in the agreement, but it's a total, and I'm not sure if it was provided to you, but we have an estimate for a total of 747, roughly, and of which 283,000 has been already built under this agreement. That is on the page 115.
So this agreement covers the whole project?
Yes.
So we're with the approval of this action, whether we have it or not, you're still going to you're going to build because the work has been done.
That's right.
So you're going to build the 283.
They're actually, they're moving into construction. They're already in the construction phase. We established last week that November 4th is the date after which this isn't reimbursable anymore. I have met with Mr. Gomez. He is the engineer of record, and he believes that the group is on track to make that date.
So
There's 283,000 at present, of which I believe 91,000 has actually been paid, and I believe the total value comes to about $750,000. Is that right?
Yes, 747. Yes.
So this is an agreement between the Bureau and IID, and all it needs is the signature of the, in this case, interim general manager. So in an abundance of prudence, we brought it to the board.
And I appreciate that. And in the future, can you bring other agreements as well?
Yes.
Yeah. And so, Mr. Gomez, so you have confidence that that all the repairs will be completed and approved and by November 4th?
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, we worked with FEMA, we provided, some work that we wanted to do it. We worked with the Bureau of Reclamation, with individuals and representatives from FEMA, and we all agreed to what we needed to do. Of course, after the designs are prepared and close analysis has been done of this structure, sometimes the scope of work is reduced, and it takes less time to come up with, finish the work, and that's basically what's happening in this case.
As we had asked Mr. Campbell in his last presentation, keep the board informed and give us as you're the engineer of record now, I guess you'll be making the reports, but we'd like to have him on a regular basis so we know exactly how the process is going.
Sure.
Are those doors of communication with the emergency officials for Imperial County, are those also open and being used?
That's probably will be an answer that should be responded by the EOC director. However, I can tell you this, since the day one, actually the day after the earthquake, we were in contact with them. They came over a couple of times, and I was assisting, the EOC and providing information because there were a lot of questions, not only with the county, but also with state officials coming over. So,
thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thank you. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, moving on to item number 15, page 148 on your agenda.
I move for approval.
Request to lease 5 motor graders. You move for approval?
Move for approval.
Is there a second?
Could we have a little discussion?
Well,
Well, I can discuss it after you get a second.
second discussion?
What is the comparison for the all-wheel drive motor grader lease to the conventional rear-wheel drive?
Let me show you a slide here. If I can find it. If you look at the difference between the all-wheel and the standard, basically it boils down to $11.69 per month per unit. And the reason that there's that small difference, when you look at the list price of the all-wheel drive and the standard drive up here, the 277 and 259, that's offset by the payback amount. So when they work through the lease amounts, the net difference only comes out to $561. And really the value of that $11.69 is easily absorbed by less wear on tires, and also in terms of those times where you need that additional effective horsepower. Beyond that, I think if water needed to, they could provide some additional feedback on that point if you needed so.
Thank you.
Any other questions? No, please vote. Okay, thank you, Mr. Bishop. Moving back to item number 5, pulled from the consent agenda on page, what page is that on? 30. It's the checks and the wires. Director Desert, you had a question?
Yeah, I had a question on one on page 57. I was going through this. There was $21,000 spent at a 99-cent store for the City of Commerce in California.
I don't know the answer to that question, but I will certainly research it and get back to you.
And then, Board President Mendoza, I was speaking with you, and you had a comment about a...
Yeah. Do we own a timeshare or a
timeshare,
condo?
Yeah, there was the
What was
condo,
that?
a condo.
Condo. It's still around.
There was, and not in this paperwork, and I had a question, but I didn't bring it with me.
What was the dollar amount on that?
It was like,
It's not in this paperwork here?
I didn't review these. It's in my notes at home. I didn't.
Also, Greg, how many more columns are there? Is there another way that we could put this data together that would kind of categorize it so we could understand it better as to what the payments are if we had a question as we're looking at it at home? Or have a code so we know and then have a breakdown as to what the code is to explain to us?
I'll have to research that. I don't know if there's a further explanation on the check register or not, or whether there's just the name of the payee and the amount and the date.
So there's just a check number of payment and then a payment date and the
Yeah.
dollar amount and who it's to.
So I can,
Do they use a coding at the IID for the checks for specific categories for reimbursement for deposits from the power department or?
well, we do. Each expense is charged to a specific account, but I'm not sure that shows up on the check register, though. This is obviously it's computer generated.
And then our claims, Mr. Garber, our legal claims that are paid, are those also in here?
I believe so. But you've got to find them.
I know.
Okay, Gloria?
I'm not talking about the big legal claims, the Matkins claims. I'm talking the smaller ones that we.
If we write a check to settle a claim, it's going to show up in the check registry. Yeah, I've seen a couple of them, but we do a report, and I don't know if you were here, Director Desert, when we've done that, but we instituted a program, I think, in the last year. And we do a quarterly report, and we show you all the legal claims. So you're going to get that through another method.
Mr. Broken, Mr. Rivera very kindly found it for me because I had talked to her about it. It's on page 51. It's $141,234.35. World Mark the Club. What's that for? Spokane, Washington? What's that for?
I don't know. That's another one I'll have
Does
to research
anybody
and
know?
get back.
Director Desert,
Worldmark would be in Spokane, Washington, would be the headquarters, so depending on what the check is for.
World Mark the Club?
Worldmark the Club.
What's that for? What do you guys?
Greg will have to put that up, but Spokane, Washington would be the headquarters for Worldmark.
actually, this came up yesterday in a staff discussion, and poor Greg he can't explain them on the spot. He can after the fact, and he will. This is the first time I think that the board has
Well, do you know what it's
acted.
What's it, Indio? So it's something in India.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it's much more innocent than it sounds, you know. But there was one last week, or the last time we met. You weren't you didn't. It wasn't set up for you to receive and file or take action like you are today. But there was like an $800 charge to Foster Freeze. It made it sound like we all went to Foster Freeze. There was actually
And you all went to the dollar store as well?
No,
A deposit, yeah.
What was it?
It was a customer refund.
Yeah, it was a refund. So he can go back and
Would you
respond to
please
your query.
Research this one in the dollar
Sure.
store question.
Yeah, no, I'll do both
Yeah,
of
then
those.
that may be a legal claim for damages from a power outage or something.
Sure.
Okay.
You want to move for approval?
Move for approval, please. Please vote. Okay, Mr. Kelly, any further business?
No, ma'am.
Meeting adjourned.